Good morning. Good morning. There we go. Now I'm on. Good morning. I was going to say close your eyes for a second, but I don't want you to go to sleep. So keep your eyes open and imagine for me, you're sitting on your sofa, nice and cuddled up. Maybe, now if you're in the north, there's a fire, but down here, we don't really need a fire. But you're nice and cuddled up, cozy, either with your loved one or your kids or your grandkids. And it's nice and peaceful. And maybe you have a glass of wine or two, and you're nice and calm and warm. Maybe there's some nice soft music playing, and you're nice and relaxed. And bam! Somebody bursts through your door. The Babylonian army bursts through your door and takes you into captivity. Yeah, kind of harsh, right? Sorry, I had to make sure you're awake with that big bang. That's what the Israelites experienced. So the Israelites were home, nice and comfy. Maybe the wine, maybe the not, maybe no music. I don't know. But they were nice and comfortable in their homes. And suddenly the Babylonian army comes in and rips them from their home and takes them into captivity. Imagine the trauma. Imagine the horror. Imagine the memories, the things you see, the sounds you hear. Those things tend to stay with you. They sort of imprint and burn themselves into your mind, and you can't get them out. That was what the Israelites were experiencing. The kind of trauma that lingers. Our reading today from the prophet Isaiah is speaking into that context. Speaking to a people of Israel who were taken into captivity. A people experiencing brokenness and trauma and heartbreak. How do you speak into that? What can you possibly say to someone who's experienced that level of trauma? Isaiah speaks of a suffering servant. A suffering servant. And this is what he says of the suffering servant. The suffering servant is upheld and chosen by God. The suffering servant is one in whom God delights and in whom the Spirit resides. The suffering servant brings forth justice to the nations. The suffering servant does not raise his voice. The suffering servant faithfully brings forth justice and works tirelessly for it. The suffering servant is a light to the nations. Will open the eyes of the blind. Will bring prisoners from their dungeons out of the darkness. The suffering servant is part of the new thing that God is doing. This idea of a suffering servant is sort of countercultural. This idea of a suffering servant is a profound example of power in the midst of vulnerability. The suffering servant gives life-giving power. Now I have a confession to make. This notion doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't make sense. I can't comprehend it. I don't understand it. This notion of a suffering servant. You see, when I'm hurting, when we're hurting, we tend to want to put up walls, put up barriers, build fences, circle the wagons. But the idea of the suffering servant says that we should be a light to the world. That makes me uncomfortable. It seems to go against everything in my being. Because when I'm hurting, when I feel broken, the last thing I want to be is a light for everyone else to see. But that's what Isaiah speaks of today. On October 22nd of 2006, Charles Roberts walked into a one-room schoolhouse, took hostages, and shot 8 of the 10 girls ages 6 to 13, killing 5 before committing suicide in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. That community was about 40 miles from where I lived at the time. The small Amish community was suddenly thrown into chaos, thrown into trauma, thrown into heartbreak. And I saw some of you going like this out of disgust. Yes, they were thrown into the midst of that disgust. On the day of the shooting, not a day later, not a week later, not a month later, on the day of the shooting, a grandfather of one of the murdered Amish girls was heard warning some young relatives not to hate the killer. And he went on to say, "We must not think evil of this man." Really? Because that's not where I go right away, if I'm being perfectly honest. That's not where I'm going right away. Another member of the community said, quote, "I don't think there's anybody here that wants to do anything but forgive. And not only reach out to those who have suffered a loss, but to reach out to the family of the man who committed these acts." A Roberts family spokesman said an Amish neighbor comforted the Roberts family for hours after the shooting and extended forgiveness to them. Amish community members visited and comforted Roberts' widow, parents, and parents-in-law. One Amish man held Robert's sobbing father in his arms, reportedly for as long as an hour, to comfort him. The Amish have also set aside a charitable fund for the family of the shooter. About 30 members of the Amish community attended the shooter's funeral. Maria Roberts, the widow, was the only member outside the community that was invited to the funerals of the children. A professor of mine, Donald Craybill at Elizabethtown College, said this: "The Amish willingness to forgo vengeance does not undo the tragedy or pardon the wrong, but rather constitutes a first step toward a future that is more hopeful." I don't know if any of us could be there, could get to that place and say those things after such a tragedy. But when I read this text this week, and this notion of a suffering servant, and this notion of being a light to the world in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of chaos, this is the only story I could think of. That community was truly being a light to the world. And I have no idea how, other than to think it has to be from God. There's no other explanation, because nothing in our human nature, in the midst of that tragedy within our community, is going to say, "I want to forgive." As your pastor, I would love to stand up here and say, in the midst of that, I would forgive instantly. I don't think I'm comfortable with that, if I'm being perfectly honest. That community was being a light to the world, and an inbreaking in the kingdom of God, in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of heartache. Now maybe that's too extreme of an example for us to picture. When the church opens its doors to the homeless, when the church opens its doors to feed the hungry, that is the church being a light to the world and an inbreaking of the kingdom of God. When a community rallies together after the complete devastation of a hurricane, in the midst of their brokenness, in the midst of their heartache, in the midst of their trauma, when they rally together, that's that community being a light to the world. That's that community with the inbreaking of God into the world. When a high school starts a national movement after a school shooting, not too far from here. That's being a light to the world. That's an inbreaking of the kingdom of God. When we're able to act with compassion instead of vengeance, that's being a light to the world. That's an inbreaking of the kingdom of God. When the hopeless see hope, maybe for the first time, that's the light of Christ. That's an inbreaking of the kingdom of God. When an addict enters recovery, that's a light to the world. That's an inbreaking of the kingdom of God. Because you see, the way the kingdom of God works, the way the light of Christ works, it works in shining through and into and out of the cracks that are within us. It shines through the brokenness that we all have. Paul refers to us as clay jars or clay vessels. When those clay vessels crack, that is where the light enters. And if you put a light inside of it, the light shines through those cracks. That's what Paul's talking about. Not Paul. That's what Isaiah is talking about. In the midst of our brokenness, still maintaining that light of Christ that comes from within and shines for the world. Now, during the season of Advent, a season of anticipation, a season of hope, a season of waiting, a season of looking forward to what's to come, let us pause and not rush to the joy of Christmas, but let us pause and reflect on the light that is about to enter the world. That's what we're waiting to celebrate. The light of Christ coming into the world, entering into the world, entering into us, and shining in us and through us and on us. That's what the Advent season is about. A season of anticipation. And I pray that we, in the midst of our brokenness, can allow the light of Christ to shine on us and through us. Let us pray.